December 6, 1941, Hitokapu Bay, Kuril Islands. Lieutenant Zenji Abe stood on the frozen deck of the carrier Akagi, watching his breath cloud in the frigid air. In the pocket of his leather flying jacket, pressed against his chest, lay a farewell note to his wife and a lock of hair for his funeral. He had penned the final lines that morning, "If I do not return, know that I served with honor." Yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, a question nagged. One he did not dare voice aloud. Were the Americans we are about to strike really the weakened nation our commanders had described? 24 hours later, that doubt would begin to answer itself in the most devastating fashion. What Japanese airmen discovered after Pearl Harbor would not only be counted in sunk ships or shattered planes, but in a far more terrifying revelation. They had not crippled a declining power. They had roused an industrial colossus that would bury them in steel, aircraft, and ships at a pace that defied belief. This is the story of Pearl Harbor from the Japanese viewpoint. Not a tale of triumph, but of a nation's slow, horrifying realization that it had challenged an enemy whose manufacturing capacity was not merely superior, but staggering. The road to Pearl Harbor had been paved with desperation rather than certainty. In July 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed a complete oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch East Indies followed. Overnight, Japan lost access to roughly 80% of its petroleum. The empire's carefully stored reserves might last perhaps 18 months in peacetime. If war came, that window shrank to less than a year. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, understood risks many of his peers would not accept. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, served as a naval attaché in Washington, walked American streets, and seen U.S. factories and abundance firsthand. In January 1941, he wrote a prescient warning. Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it will not be enough to seize Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, or San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate peace in the White House. Did our politicians truly grasp the final cost and prepare to make the necessary sacrifices? He asked himself. He knew such an outcome was impossible, yet Yamamoto was loyal to his country. And when Tokyo decided on war, he accepted the task of planning the strike. His strategy was stark and brutal in its logic. Hit the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor with overwhelming force, sink the battleships, destroy the aircraft on the ground, and then buy time, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year, to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber of Malaya. From that position of resource control, Japan hoped to negotiate peace before American industry could fully mobilize. It was a gambler's plan from a man who understood odds, and like most gamblers, he would lose. The first strike force departed Hitokapu Bay on November 26, 1941. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiru, Shukaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 7 fuel tankers, and 3 submarines. Aircraft aboard the carriers representing the finest naval aviators in the world. They maintained absolute radio silence for the entire 3,500 minutes journey across the North Pacific. The northern route through waters ravaged by winter storms was chosen specifically because it was rarely traveled. American reconnaissance aircraft would not be searching these freezing seas. The fleet reached its launch position 30 per hour semi north of Oahu at 0600 hours on December 7th. 1941, Commander Mitsuo Fuida, leading the first wave of 183 aircraft, lifted off from Akagi's flight deck as dawn broke across the Pacific. For months, the pilots had trained over Kagoshima Bay, chosen because its geography mirrored Pearl Harbor, mountains dropping to a shallow harbor, requiring precision approaches at extreme low altitude. The torpedo bombers had practice releasing their weapons at altitudes of just 10 to 20 meters above the water. The torpedoes were designed to run at depths of 10 millimeters below the surface instead of the standard deeper depths that would strike the harbor bottom. One pilot, Koname Harada Kaakmi, has signed to carrier Soryu. So RYO had sent his pregnant wife back to her family home in Nagano in September when training intensified. Following Japanese custom, neither showed emotion at their goodbye, though she wrote to him daily until the ship departed. At 0740 hours Hawaiian time, Fue's formation spotted the installations at Pearl Harbor spread below them. The harbor was crowded with ships, 8 battleships moored along Battleship Row. The fleet was in port exactly as intelligence had predicted. But something was wrong. Something crucial. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not present. They were at sea, their locations unknown. Fuka made his decision in seconds. The attack would proceed. He slid back the canopy of his Nakajima B-5N2 and fired a single dark blue flare, the signal his pilots had trained for months to recognize. Then he transmitted 3 words that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete surprise. Achieve. You achieved. The attack lasted 1 hour and 15 minutes across 2 waves. 2.43 Americans died. 170 AWAT were wounded. 2 battleships, Arizona and Oklahoma, became total losses that would never return to service. 4 more battleships, West Virginia, California, Nevada, and Tennessee, suffered severe damage, but would eventually be salvaged and repaired. 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 5 witty submarines, and 64 men. By any conventional military measure, it was an extraordinary success. But as the Japanese pilots circled above the smoking harbor, preparing to return to their carriers, some observed details that would later haunt them. The massive oil storage tanks on the shore, holding millions of gallons of fuel, sat untouched. The submarine base was intact. The repair facilities were undamaged. The dry docks remained operational. And those 3 carriers were still out there somewhere in the Pacific, untouched and lethal. Lieutenant Zenji Abe flew in the second wave, piloting an Aichi D-3A dive bomber. By the time his formation arrived over Pearl Harbor, the Arizona was already a burning wreck. Her forward magazines detonated by a bomb from the first wave that killed 177 men in a single catastrophic explosion. Abe targeted ships still capable of fighting, adding his bombs to the destruction already underway. The question that had gnawed at him on the frozen deck of Akagi found no answer in the smoke and fire below. Only more questions. Aboard Akagi, Commander Fuida urged Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagamo to launch a 3rd wave to return and destroy the fuel tanks and repair facilities. Nagamo refused. The first air fleet had achieved its objective. The element of surprise was lost. American forces were now fully alert. The carriers must withdraw before the American carriers found them. The decision was tactically sound and strategically catastrophic. The ships that Japan had damaged would be raised. The Iden aircraft would be replaced. But that choice to leave the infrastructure intact would allow Pearl Harbor to remain operational as the forward base for the entire Pacific Fleet throughout the war. As the Japanese fleet steamed back toward home waters, the pilots began to process what they had witnessed. Yes, they had sunk battleships. Yes, they had achieved surprise. But the American base they had attacked revealed something deeply troubling. The scale of Pearl Harbor's facilities, the number of ships present, the infrastructure visible even from their attack altitude. All suggested an industrial capacity far beyond what Japanese intelligence had described. If this was just one American base, how many more existed? The question would be answered with brutal mathematical precision over the following months. In 1941, Japan had produced 5,088 aircraft. The United States had produced $19,433, nearly 4 times more. In 1942, as Japan struggled to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway in June, the United States commissioned USS Essex, the first of a class that would eventually number 24 ships. Japan entered the war with 10 carriers. After Midway, it would never operate more than 6 simultaneously again. The numbers grew more devastating with each passing year. By 1943, American factories were producing approximately 8,000 to 9,000 aircraft per month. Japanese production for the entire year reached 16,000. The United States produced more in 2 months than Japan managed in 12. The SS Robert E. Peary, a Liberty ship, was constructed in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. The keel was laid at 1 minute past midnight on November 8, 1942. The ship launched on November 12th. While this was a publicity demonstration and normal production averaged 42 to 50 days, by 1943, American shipyards were completing 3 Liberty ships every 2 days. In the first 4 months of 1943 alone, American yards launched more merchant tonnage than Japan had built in 7 years of war preparation. The aircraft production gap was equally devastating. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. The Willower Run plant in Michigan, operated by Ford Motor Company, produced B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes, 24 hours per day. Each bomber contained 1,550,000 parts. American workers assembled them faster than Japanese factories could produce fighters to defend against them. By late 1943, Japanese pilots were beginning to encounter a phenomenon that their training had not prepared them for. American forces operating with seemingly unlimited resources. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Task Force 58 brought together 15 American carriers and 900 aircraft, launching strikes that Japanese defenses simply could not match. The Japanese aircraft that opposed them, many flown by hastily trained replacement pilots following the catastrophic losses at Midway and subsequent battles, were slaughtered in what American pilots grimly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost between 350 and 600 aircraft and 2 more carriers. The American industrial machine was now operating ATA pace that made Japanese resistance mathematically impossible. The pilots who survived long enough to witness this transformation faced a psychological devastation as complete as any physical defeat. Japanese pilots wrote home in growing despair after Midway. Where are all these aircraft coming from? We shoot them down and the sky fills with replacements. This is industrial annihilation. By 1945, Japan's situation had become hopeless. The oil supplies captured in the Dutch East Indies could not reach Japanese refineries. American submarines produced at a rate Japanese shipyards could never match had effectively severed the supply lines. Oil tankers lay on the ocean floor by the hundreds. Japan's navy, once the 3rd largest in the world, was reduced to harbor defense. The elite pilots who had trained at Kagoshima Bay, who had achieved complete surprise at Pearl Harbor, were mostly dead, replaced by boys with months of training instead of years. Some were sent on one-way missions, kamikaze attacks, the final admission that conventional naval aviation could no longer compete. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were almost redundant. Japan's industrial capacity was already destroyed, its cities burned by conventional bombing, its navy gone, its air force reduced to suicide attacks. The empire that had struck at Pearl Harbor believing 6 months of victories would force a negotiated peace, had instead triggered the full mobilization of an industrial power that produced at rates beyond Japanese comprehension. America built 297,000 foreign aircraft during the war, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. Japan's total wartime production, across nearly every category, amounted to less than 10% of America's output, and, in many cases, under 5%. Admiral Yamamoto's warning had come true in the most tragic way imaginable. After 6 months, he had said, "I will have no confidence in victory." On April 18, 1943, his prediction died with him when American fighters, guided by intercepted and decoded JN-25B communications that exposed his inspection route, ambushed and shot down his transport plane over Bougainville. He never witnessed the full disaster his Pearl Harbor gamble had unleashed, but he had understood it long before anyone else. He had walked the streets of America, toured its industries, and grasped the enormity of its capacity. His final wager had been that courage and skill could compensate for industrial inferiority. He was wrong. The surviving Japanese pilots, including Lieutenant Zenji Abe and others who had participated in the Pearl Harbor strike, would spend the rest of their lives reflecting on that truth. The raid had been a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic catastrophe. They had not crippled a feeble opponent. They had provoked a sleeping colossus whose power of production exceeded imagination. The oil embargo that drove Japan to war was intended to halt its expansion, yet it instead revealed the true global balance of industrial strength. A nation that had transformed itself into a modern power in barely half a century had dared to confront one with 17 times its national income, 5 times its steel output, and twice its population. Once America's factories mobilized, the outcome was never in doubt. It was not superior strategy or battlefield genius that doomed Japan, but sheer, unstoppable productivity. American shipyards launched vessels faster than they could be sunk. Its assembly lines rolled out aircraft quicker than they could be destroyed. Every month, the relentless pace of U.S. industry made Japan's resistance more hopeless. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the empire that had struck Pearl Harbor 4 years earlier had been crushed, not only by American valor, but by the industrial machine that stood behind it. The aviators who once soared above Oahu had, in truth, awakened a giant, and that giant buried them beneath an ocean of steel.